Scholastic Audio presents Days of Infamy, How a Century of Bigotry Led to Japanese-American Internment by Lawrence Goldstone. Read by Elena Davis. Although all but a few thousand Japanese immigrants and citizens lived on the West Coast, the tensions between them and the white population had exploded into a national issue decades before the attack on Pearl Harbor. In January 1921, for example, a prestigious academic journal, the Annals of the American Academy of Political and Social Science, published in Philadelphia, devoted an entire issue to present-day immigration with special reference to the Japanese. There were 23 articles from such diverse contributors as the openly and proudly racist United States Senator and former mayor of San Francisco, James D. Phelan, to Baron Shinpei Goto, now Goto Shinpei, who had been the Japanese Minister for Foreign Affairs. The arguments on both sides were almost identical to those that would appear 20 years later. Baron Goto asserted that the Japanese in California live very plainly and work very industrially and fulfill a useful and, I should say, almost unreplaceable function in the economic life of the state. Their honesty is unimpeachable, so much so that I have often heard it said that banks will advance them money on the conditions which, if proposed by Americans, will be refused. They are, of course, entirely peaceful. Senator Phelan, on the other hand, in an article titled "Why California Objects to the Japanese Invasion," called for Congress to act immediately on the Japanese problem, and that we admire their industry and cleverness, but for that very reason, being a masterful people, they are more dangerous. Phelan went on, "The people of Asia have a destiny of their own. We shall aid them by instruction and example, but we cannot suffer them to overwhelm the civilization which has been established by pioneers and patriots, and which we are dutifully bound to preserve." Then, in words that could easily have been uttered in 2019 about other races, Phelan said, "We are willing to receive diplomats, scholars, and travelers from Japan on terms of equality, but we do not want her laborers." Another critic, John S. Chambers, the California State Controller, insisted, "Assimilation is impossible," and compared the Japanese to rodents. Watch the gopher at work. He starts to bore into a levee, and as he progresses, he is joined by more of his kind. Then, in due time, the other side of the embankment is reached, and a little stream of water passes through. As the dirt crumbles, a flow increases, and unless promptly checked, the bore soon becomes a wide gap with the water rushing through and overflowing the land. That is the flood that means loss and perhaps eventual disaster. That is exactly what is happening in the state of California today through the Japanese policy of peaceful penetration. During the next 2 decades, however, many Japanese people not only assimilated, but also showed every sign of becoming a vital and indispensable part of the economies of Western states, which infuriated the anti-Japanese faction all the more. An official report noted that by 1910, the Japanese produced about half of the entire amount of Californian agricultural products marketed. Their position was substantially the same as that of the Chinese, except that the sector of agriculture which they occupied had grown to be very much more important than it had been at the time of the Chinese. In the aftermath of Pearl Harbor, white supremacists had their opportunity. They were able to not only claim foresight for insisting the Japanese were a treacherous race, but also to finally persuade the government in Washington to take the sort of action they had been urging for decades. And so, more than 100,000 people were deported, their homes and businesses either seized or vandalized, and in many cases, their lives ruined forever. The story of the bigotry, prejudice, and oppression foisted on Americans of Japanese ancestry for almost half a century by individuals, government officials, and justices of the Supreme Court is one that resonates today. White supremacy, the banner under which these injustices were perpetrated, not only to those of Asian heritage but to black and brown people and indigenous Americans as well, has been revived, not simply as an outlook hidden in the shadows, but is one that many are willing, even proud, to proclaim publicly. And so, the United States government's treatment of the Japanese is also a story of today's America, and the lessons of that terrible period in our history are lessons the nation cannot be allowed to forget. Although to combat bigotry and discrimination is the job of every American, the Supreme Court will once again be the venue where racism is either accepted or rejected in American law.